Hey folks, it looks like we are live with the week's counter clipping stream. Let me punch out all of the social media stuff. At some point, I'll figure out how the actual professionals do this, which probably means they have some kind of automated thing, which I don't have or do. So, the topic for the week is old war games. They are being reprinted in greater and greater numbers. It seems like weekly or monthly. Monthly is not an exaggeration by much. We hear reports of some ancient wargame being given a new edition by some publisher or other. Now, I think Compass has come to be associated more closely with this phenomenon than other publishers, but GMT has done it too, and in fact, even Multiman has done it with stuff like Panzer Blitz Hill of Death, and even for that matter, reprints of old Great Campaigns of the American Civil War games, for example. So, before we get to that, let me talk a little bit about assorted news and things. We're clipping Burma again. We'll be able to finish this this session. That will, in fact, be the goal for counterclipping for tonight. I did not get back to this during the week, or it would be done, and I would have moved on to something else. It is likely that the next thing to get clipped, I haven't made this decision, but it might be, because it's here, might be Time for Trumpets from GMT, which has arrived, and which is a large and very attractive package. So I would like to thank everybody who is here already for stopping by. Let me just check on the chat. Yep, there we go. Early last week, I got bad news. And I mentioned this on Twitter. Those of you who follow me up on Twitter may have caught this. One of the guys I used to game with back in Cleveland, and with whom I was very close friends for a long time. And I mean, I haven't seen him in probably 3 or 4 years, but I still consider him a quite close friend. His son was killed by a drunk driver on Sunday or Monday. And that took a lot of gas out of me for the whole week. And I, am scarcely one of the more affected people by this tragedy. So they were two 19-year-old kids in a stopped car were hit by an 80 mile an hour driving drunk woman from North Royalton, Ohio. This was all over the Northeast Ohio news. So it's it was a tragedy for the family, but it does seem like a lot of people came together over it. These two boys were so close; they're having a joint funeral, or had a joint funeral. So that was bad news, and not to start us off on a huge downer or anything. Sorry about that. But please drink responsibly. Among other things. So there's been some delays in getting the Traveler thing started. It is still in the works. I hope to be able to make a formal announcement next week. That won't happen this week at this point. Because a lot of the fuel that was going into the Traveler Tuesday videos is now being channeled into this instead, as you can imagine. So I hope to be able to have, for next Tuesday, but not tomorrow, a formal Traveler announcement video. On the subject of role-playing games, some who follow me on Twitter, if you're not following me on Twitter and you are on Twitter, please do so. There's a link in the video description. There's been drama in the RPG tabletop community revolving around a Kickstarter project called The Perfect RPG, which is tied into some zine thing that I'm not really fully informed on, but the short version is that a large number of indie RPG luminaries were asked to contribute to this perfect RPG zine, and one of them was a person that the tabletop community doesn't like anymore, for valid reasons. So there was a big kerfluffle over that, and I'm very disappointed in a number of people that I wasn't previously disappointed in. And I don't really feel informed enough about it to like sum it all up, because there's a lot of like background that would be difficult to explain, and I don't want to drop another lead weight on this thing. So the better news is that we did do our Thursday game of Hungarian Rhapsody, and I think we are pretty close to resetting Hungarian Rhapsody at this point and calling it a German victory just on time. Germans launched a major counterattack south of Budapest with 5 Panzer divisions, and they did a substantial amount of damage to Soviet forces down there. Soviets renewed the offensive and then did some damage to some of those Panzer divisions. And I think it was not as decisive as the Germans had hoped, but it was super scary looking for the Russians. But I think it probably puts us back enough, considering we're already behind the timetable. It already puts us back on the back foot for as far as getting Budapest. We have to basically take Budapest by mid-February, and we are now in the 1st of January. So this evening we are drinking Glenlivet Caribbean Reserve. This is no age statement, relatively inexpensive. Glenlivet finished in rum casks, and it's not bad. It's definitely getting a lot of rum nose from the casks, a little less on the palate. So Panzer's Last Stand. So this actually came up today. Panzer's Last Stand is the latest in the BCS series, and it has made its number over at MMP. It's made its pre-order number. I have some playthrough video of the BCS series in the form of Brazen Chariots on the channel, so check that out if you like. The takeaway is that both the artillery and the air rules, I think, were not reflective of the situations that the system is attempting to simulate in the games after the first game, which was the Bulge game. However, the new edition of the BCS rules, which will launch with Panzer's Last Stand, does at least fix I'm going to call it artillery. It's a little more complicated than that. Standoff support is the actual term that we're looking for. We didn't think it was working right, and we were right. It wasn't working right. And that appears to have been fixed in this new edition. But the air rules are essentially, which are super abstract. They basically, it's like a DRM that applies. With a small number of air points. And it doesn't feel authentic in the desert, and I don't know if it will feel authentic in Hungary or not over Budapest, because that's where Panzer's Last Stand takes place, because apparently there was quite a fierce air war over that area, but I mean, we're not really seeing that reflected in the OCS game either. The map area, both are 4-map games, interestingly enough, Hungarian Rhapsody and Panzer's Last Stand. And this actually interestingly ties into the topic of the evening, actually, because MMP, the gamers, now has done a number of projects where they have essentially republished the same game under both BCS and OCS, or OCS and SCS. That's not really what this is, but like Autumn for Barbarossa kind of is Smolensk in SCS, for example. So it is kind of rehashing the same material. So for energy, I of course have the Drink of Gamers diet. old gamers is Diet Mountain Dew. If I was a young, thin gamer, it would be regular Mountain Dew. As it used to be back in the day. So, give me energy to make it through this thing tonight. So, let's move from that, and I'll talk about that later. Remind me if anyone would like to hear more about Panzer's Last Stand later in the stream. But I want to get to the topic, because I think it's an interesting topic. As I mentioned, we're seeing more and more of these old games being reprinted, either by Compass or now from GMT, and Victory Games is probably an exceptionally juicy target for that, because they have games that were at least some of their games were ahead of their time. Some of their games were more complicated than people were comfortable with at the time, but today's market is friendlier towards complicated games than I think the market in the 80s was, and that's maybe a topic for another stream, actually. So a lot of the things that we've been seeing are, in fact, from Victory Games. The fact that they're they're in a little bit of a maybe gray area, because, maybe they're owned by Hasbro, maybe they're owned by the original designers, maybe they're owned by who knows. Whereas, for the most part, SPI titles have clear ownership at this point. Most SPI titles, anyway. They're either with Excalibur Games in a few cases, or with Decision Games. So we have the new release, the new announcement of a new release that will be coming along, and this has made its number as of a couple of days ago. The Victory Games Vietnam will be coming back in what is essentially an unchanged edition. They have made it clear. Mitch Land, who will be doing the development on this, has made it clear that he is not interested in making major structural changes to that game. They might clean a few things up, but for the most part, they are not going to make changes to that game. However, as some people have pointed out, the state of historiography about the Vietnam War now is a vastly different landscape than it was in the 1980s. There are so many more better sources available, and I think people who are more familiar than me with that history and historiography are going to point out the problems that are illuminated in the Victory Games Vietnam that we are aware of now that were less clear back in I think the game thing was released in 1986 or 1987. Somebody will mention it. We also have from Compass, we have a new edition of the Victory Games Civil War, which is a fantastic game, and which is also going to be one of these sort of minimally changed editions. Now, to be completely honest about it, my initial instinct on this topic is to be happy that these classic games, these games that I think deserved to be in print this entire time, are going to be back in print. And that's fine. I mean, that's fine. But the question gets to be, we have already seen those games, right? Is the republication of these old games taking up too much publisher bandwidth that could be getting expended on new voices and new topics, for that matter, in wargaming, right? Is it a resource drain on newer ideas, newer designers, newer topics that we maybe... Vietnam is a terrible example of this, because there are relatively few games about the Vietnam War. Relatively few. But, like the Victory Games Civil War, there's a crap ton of games about the Civil War at every level. Are we... And so in that case, this maybe is a better example of the question. Is it a bad thing that we're seeing at least so many of these now? And again, my first instinct is to say no, not at all. But, upon further reflection, it is not impossible that this trend is actually distracting publishers, and maybe designers too, from doing new stuff. And that would probably be undesirable. So I want to hear what people think, as and I'm going to give people time to put things in the chat while I bust out the last couple of counters that I need here. We have, oh right, water buffalo transport points. That's what they look like anyway, or ox drawn, something like that. Yeah, we got to get these improved road markers too, don't we? Well, we'll figure it out. And we have special airstrip markers in this game as well. We used to... So Brant says, probably tongue-in-cheek, we should reprint all the ones that he's been looking for and couldn't find, and none of the ones that he already has that everybody else wants. Which is, I'm sure Brant means this tongue-in-cheek, but I have actually seen people take, in fact, that exact position. as ludicrous as it sounds, that is essentially what I have actually seen. And that is an embarrassing display in such a case. Tony Mammal says, the people reprinting are also much more willing to improve the look and styling, too, making them much more appealing to newer players. Now, that's unquestionably true. And again, this is another area where Victory Games is particularly susceptible to this. A lot of Victory Games titles are very difficult to read to the modern eye. They had an enormous bleed buffer on the borders of their counters. They forced... all the factors and important information into very tiny print in the center of the counter. That not only makes the counters ugly, but it makes them hard to read even at the time, let alone now when you got a bunch of irritable old coots trying to play these things. I looked at, I acquired not too long ago, some months really, but a copy of Hell's Highway, and man, those counters are terrible. So it's certainly nice, gonna be nice for those people who like those games to get copies with nicer art, more modern looking art, more readable counters. One of the things that we're going to see with the Victory Games Vietnam is the counters are going to be bigger. I believe they're going to be, I think 9/16, like the informational counters are going to be 1/2 inch, less like the old ones. And I think the unit markers will be either 9/16 or 5/8. This actually, the other topic that I thought of related to Victory Games, the GMT version of Victory Games Vietnam was the cost. 3 maps, 6 counter sheets. That's a $200 game from anybody but GMT. GMT's pre-order price is, what, $59 or something like that? It's crazy cheap for a game that size. That's plus. Remember some of those, like the old Avalon Hill games with the pink and blue counters. Man, nobody likes those things. Whew, those were ugly. All right. So Grumbling Grognard mentions from Compass their version of the Russian campaign. There are not one but 2 new versions of the Russian campaign coming out. One from GMT and one from Compass. Those are separate, and they're going to be different games, right? The one from Compass is going to be basically a redo of the old Jedco Russian campaign, where the one from GMT is going to be a spruced up and somewhat modernized version of Russian campaign. Fall of Tobruk, Rommel's greatest victory. NATO, the Bruce Maxwell NATO, that's coming. We have an interview with Bruce about that. That looks good. I mean, that is an example of a game where Bruce has really taken that thing back in-house and really fixed it up in such a way that I think it's going to end up being a very good game. And I mean, sight unseen, I say that. This is my impression right now. That looks like it's going to be worth a look if you're interested in that subject at all. Decision Games D-Day Quad is a new title, or relatively new. It's a redo of the old D-Day folios that they did a couple of years ago. It is not like an old SPI thing or anything like that. It's a redo for Decision, but they clearly bundled it. They put a box together, but then did the same maps, and I think it's mounted map though. But they have the same thin counters. It's not a system that I like. It's the fire and movement system, but it's not what we're talking about here today. Well, no structural changes. I mean, they're making the hexes and the counters bigger. That's not a structural change. That's a presentational change. Tony points out the other benefit is that there is enough information out there to know if you're interested in them. Hence, you will know when you... Okay, so that's true, too. It is a lot easier to find info on these games that you're interested in now than it necessarily was back in the day. That is absolutely an actual factor that can be important. Back in the day, you had a catalog, or a flyer or something you got in the mail, and you got a line that maybe gave you a short paragraph on what the game was. And if you didn't know anybody with the game, you were buying it blind. Maybe you could go into a retail store and look at the back of the box and get a little more information, but that was only in cases where there was information on the back of the box. I mean, remember, SPI shipped a lot of their box games with blank backs. GDW did that for a few years as well. Now, both companies, I'm not sure SPI ever did get away from that, actually. GDW did. Richard Kerr points out newer gamers would like to play the older games, and is it fair to them? Well, I mean, newer gamers are always free to go rustle stuff up on the secondary market, too, and we have also better access, thanks to the internet, to the secondary market now. Relatively few, so you could score a copy of Victory Games Pacific War for about $100 before the announcement on eBay. You could get a copy of Vietnam for $60, $70, $80. You could get a copy of the Civil War for $30, $40, $50. Those were about the prices that I was seeing, and those have been impacted southward by the announcements that all three of those games, which I think, I guess I'll add to that list the Joe Belkowski Korean War, because to me those four games kind of represent the big four from Victory Games. That's not to leave out NATO: The Next War, which, like I said, looks good. But those were, in some sense, those remain the definitive simulations of those topics. In the eyes of some, at least. And therefore, it would have been my preference to have seen those in print the whole time. It was also pointed out to me at some point that, and I may have mentioned this in a previous stream, that tax law changed sometime in the late 70s or early 80s, such that it became impracticable for companies to hang on to inventory, and that has affected the ability of some publishers to maintain titles in print. There's probably like a business philosophy angle there that I don't feel qualified to or prepared to discuss in the context of what we're talking about here tonight. But let's say that the publisher of all 4 or 5 of those games, or however many games you want to say, had remained in business this whole time and had kept those games in print this whole time. Surely we would have seen new editions and revisions and stuff like that in most of those cases. And in some of those cases, we probably would have ended up with exactly what we see in the current landscape, which is some new versions of these games that are essentially untouched except to improve the graphics, and others which are, I don't want to say totally redesigned, but which have been substantially modified. That is how games evolve, right? So we take an example of a game like For the People, which has been through 2 publishers and has been through a number of different printings, and which has changed a little bit in that time, but not a ton. I mean, it's gotten a new map. Paths of Glory has gotten a new map as well. It's been through several printings. Paths of Glory originated with GMT, of course, whereas For the People originated with Avalon Hill. That's, maybe one of the earlier examples of a modern wargaming company reprinting an older game from a still active designer from a dead company. Let's look at the chat here. Lead Magnet says if all they did was upgrade the counters and maps on the old games, he'd be happy. And I think a lot of people feel that way. I think a lot of people probably feel, in specific cases at least, that sometimes these games don't particularly need to be improved. That is probably, and you probably got kind of a point. I mean, the reason why, in many cases, there's some head scratchers, in the list of titles we're talking about here. But none of the things I've mentioned so far have really been head scratchers. They are getting reprinted in part because they are considered good games that hold up well today, even though they may have been, and in fact have been, out of print for decades. I will be happy to see that I will be able to point people at the Victory Games Civil War that is in print again, or the Victory Games Pacific War that is in print again, if they are interested in that particular type of coverage of those topics. We are getting super backed up on the chat. We have over 70 people in the stream, so I would like to thank everybody for stopping by. So Jeffrey Wesovich says, and this is the question right here, but it's also the question that I don't have the hard number. How many designers aren't getting funded because publishers are adding reboots into their mix? That's the question. Is that number non-zero? I suspect that it is. I can't prove that it is. Without cornering, somebody like a Gene Billingsley or somebody like that, or a Bill Thomas. I don't have, so we have there's a number of variables. We've talked in previous streams about production pipeline bottlenecks that, we obviously see GMT is suffering from at the moment. Now, right now, it seems obvious that COVID is impacting that, but it's not like, that wasn't obvious with GMT even before COVID. So clearly their production is somewhat bottlenecked. I cannot speak to the specific reasons for that because I don't know enough about GMT's production process or supply pipeline or any of that. There's also, I have favorite old games. I'd love to see... What's a good example? I'd love to see... I'd love to see a new edition of War in Europe, but that's something that's been worked on. If it does come back at some point, it would be obscene. Again, it would be obscenely expensive. And actually, we could limit this entire discussion to examples inside the ecosystem of Decision Games, because they have the rights to a lot of the old SPI games, and they have in fact done exactly this thing. But that's kind of what, Doc wanted when he bought those rights too. Now we have an example of a corner that does not want to clip well. I am actually going to flip the clipper upside down to do it. Got it. That corner. So with this standard clipper, sometimes they catch a little bit and they take more off the side than they should, and the counter looks bad as a result. Normally, you can feel that. I've been doing this for a while. I can feel it catch. And normally, what I do is I just move past that corner, move to the next corner, and then come back to it. And normally, on the second pass, I can get it and it's fine. Not in that particular case. That was not fine, and I had to flip it over. I think that's the first time I've had to do that on stream. I'm doing this stage by stage here because we have a kind of weird way that I'm organizing the units in order to fit the whole game in one tray. Okay. Brant says if it helps keep companies in business so that they can continue to produce at least some new cool things, then the occasional reprint is just fine. Well, I think everybody would agree with that. Tony Mammal points out that a new game is more risk. That is almost certainly true. It is an unknown quantity. You can say, and have some, you might not be right, but you'd have some confidence in saying, hey, we're going to reprint the victory game Civil War. I think it's going to do reasonably well. I think that's a reasonable assumption to make. With a new game, you might not know. We've seen, I'm going to use Compass as an example only because I've seen more of their recent output, and I'm specifically thinking of No Motherland Without, which there's an unboxing video of from last week. That's a risky game. I mean, nobody's done a game like that where one side plays like North Korea for half a century. That is a new thing, right? We have not seen a game like that, and that's great. Did a reprint title get in the way of producing that on the part of Compass? I don't see that it did, at least on the part of Compass, at least for this specific example. And everybody's probably got a list. Well, every old guy that was around back in the day probably does have a list of old things that they would personally like to see reprinted. And I certainly do. Jim Morzowski is here. Thanks, Jim, for stopping by. He's taking a time off from his streaming every single night of Tabletop Simulator. Brand says bring back Ambush, and Jim says it's therefore deficient because it's a solitaire game. A lot of people liked Ambush a lot, and I never played Ambush. I will say that of the guys, the guys that I was playing with back in the 90s that had a super low opinion of victory games in general, Ambush was one of the few games that they actually liked. Panzer says he'd like to see new games get published with some of that philosophy and them getting at their stories through the medium of more detailed and intricate systems. Boy, I think we see that. I mean, maybe not necessarily from GMT or Compass, but I absolutely think we see that. I can definitely find examples of that. One example I can think of, and it's not out yet, but it's coming, is that Under the Iron Cross, or Under the Southern Cross, or Beneath the Southern Cross. I can never get the title straight. That is coming from Compass, and I think Bill Cooper is the designer. And that's exactly what that is. That is, a more detailed look at Flat Top. And we've mentioned it here before. Bis Nunya mentions that Rob Bama's War for the Union, but the new version improves on the original. I'm going to have to take your word for that. I don't have the new one, nor have I played the original. I have spoken to people who liked the original, however. Bama's Guns of August World War II redo with Compass, retitled Empires and Alliances, not so improved. Yeah, so, boy, Guns of August is a tough game to redo. In part because I think Guns of August is guilty of many sins. Let me put it that way. I think Guns of August put wargamers and wargame designers off of World War I as a topic for 30 years. Because it's a grind. It is exactly the grind fest that you would expect a World War I game at that level to be. And it is, it took Paths of Glory, I think, to show people that you could still get a decent and engaging game out of it without it being a grind fest. Gordon also mentions that the P500 system is an incredibly low-risk publishing model. Not as low risk as I think you think it is. Because they're placing the print orders before they charge credit cards. So let's take as our example something that I hope will be out this year. The new second edition of Vance von Bory's Barbarossa Army Group Center. That thing's been on P500 for something like 8 or 9 or 10 years. What percentage? I'm going to stipulate that a significant percentage of people who pre-ordered that, their credit card information is no longer valid. I'm gonna say that there's a significant percentage of charges, when GMT charges for that won't go through for that reason, because it has been on P500 for all that time. Now, that said, the P500 system does provide a significant amount of insulation against unpleasant surprises and games that just completely tank upon release. There are companies that do a very similar systems, like Multiman, although it's not 500, it's a basically very similar system. Compass's system is not a P500 system. They offer games for pre-order, but they're basically, when they offer them for pre-order, they're going to do them. It's never a mystery. The only thing that was like that was their reprint thing, where if they reached 125 or whatever it was, they would do a reprint. And I think they abandoned that. But they also just decided to reprint some of those, or managed to do a new version of them one way or the other, one of which was like Nations in Arms. John Longshore points out that War in Europe is getting redone as a magazine game, a series of 9 magazine games, as I recall. I have low confidence in that project, to be honest. Bill Broadhurst mentions that Decision's Free Mars is supposed to replace SPI's Battlefleet Mars. I also have lower faith in that. I'm curious to see it, though. They have a new version of Starforce coming as well. Starforce was a very interesting system. And at some point I'll do a video on Starforce X, because I have a copy now. With counters that were clipped not by me in such a way as to allow the person drawing the chits to cheat, which is hilarious. So that may be where we get our here's how to make counters video too. So I'm gonna give you the exact quote from the esteemed Jim Orzowski here. And I'm not arguing with Jim in any way here. Honestly, given that every DG remake that I cared about turned out to be hot, flaming garbage, I am happy to have the originals. End quote. I'm not sure that that's true for me in every case, but certainly there have been cases in which I have been disappointed. So we're not going to argue that. At some point, I'm probably going to chicken out on doing a stream topic of what is the worst Wargame publisher. DMAW says that he wishes DG just updated the artwork. They have added or modified the rules for many of those titles, sometimes deceptively, as they do make this clear from the product descriptions. Sometimes they don't make it particularly clear. I don't feel like the product descriptions are particularly descriptive. They have, in fact, done that. And so, like, something like Napoleon's Last Battles, which they have still in print. This is, I think, their second or third version of Napoleon's Last Battles. That is the same game as it was back in the SPI days, right? There are some new options, but they are options. You can ignore them and play it exactly as you played it in 1978 or whatever, with nicer new pieces. I actually don't like the counters for their current version of Napoleon's Last Battles, but that's my opinion. I like the OSG counters better, and I like the rules better too, but that's just me. Pitchforks and torches. Bisson Nunez says he just started clipping his counters. He wouldn't go back to using unclipped for play copies again. I completely agree. I mean, I've felt that way for a long time. And let me get the current batch into the... Where's our 56th Infantry? Okay. Got to get 56th Infantry first. I completely agree. I have told the story before, but I'll say it again. We are at 81 people, by the way. Again, thanks everybody for stopping by on a record torpedoing stream evening. We have blown the existing record out of the water. I don't know if they're worse, but I don't like them. I agree that the worst publisher ever was probably Bayonet Games. There's probably somebody in the chat that's going to take, somebody watching that's going to take that seriously. That's Brant in the chat. Was Bayonet Games, pretty much. The TSR version, I'm not sure I'm successfully bringing to mind the counters or maps from the TSR version. However, I generally speaking did not like TSR's, the Spitzer era components. I'll tell you that. Center nibs on all the counters, which is gross. They managed to take what were not the world's most handsome maps for something like Terrible Swift Sword and make them much, 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 much uglier. I mean, those are, and their Wellington's Victory maps are pretty hideous as well, actually. Jim says, booze up and riot. I agree. Oh, that's true. I forgot about that. Armchair Dragoons will be doing their podcast. Will be releasing a new podcast episode this week, on which yours truly will be one of the two guests. So check that out. We'll be talking about something we have talked about on stream before, which is role-playing elements in your war games, or vice versa. I kind of wanted to get a boxed version of Napoleon's Last Battles, an SPI boxed version, but those go very expensive. Very expensive, and I was not about to pay $100 or $150 for it, so I decided to go with the new OSG version, which is called Napoleon's Last Gamble, and I was very happy with that in all respects, rules-wise, graphics-wise, all that stuff. So I'm decided, and the system supports a myriad other Napoleonic campaigns. The new game in the Library of Napoleonic Battles is Napoleon in Spain, and it should be out presently, as in like sometime in the next couple of weeks. I should be able to bring you a video on that. John Sai, thanks for stopping by from the Philippines. 9:40 a.m. Okay, that's not so bad. I get complaints almost every week now from people in Europe, in the EU, or time zones or adjacent time zones that this is just too late for. So at some point, I will probably have to do a stream at a different time so that I can make those people feel less bad. I actually agree. I think that, like the original games that Spitzer did, I think that ETO and PTO are actually probably the most interesting. Europa's had a number of spiritual successors over the years. At the moment, we have two spiritual successors going, one of which is the Frank Chadwick, whatever that thing that Thunder in the East is part of is called, and then we have John Bannerman's Third World War project, the Second World War project, sorry. Headquarters. Where are the headquarters? Interesting. Okay. We are almost done with this thing already, actually. Not quite, but we're making good progress. Getting it in one tray is not going to be an issue. So, the Pepto-Bismol is exactly the color that appears on those maps, Stigler, by the way, as you're aware. They are some of the worst-looking wargame maps I've ever seen. Now, I will say that I believe that they are rivaled in that capacity by the maps in many, but not all necessarily, games in the Gamers Civil War Brigade series. Those maps, I've had, I think, 2 or 3 of those pass through my hands at various times over the years. And those maps are uniformly gross and hideous. That's, Gordon mentions that use of different size counters for different size units is a UI thing. So that is something that Thunder in the East does. I thought that was gimmicky and distracting, actually. in principle, I don't dislike the idea. And in fact, the GMT Vietnam is going to do that. The units are going to be one size, and the markers are going to be another size. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad idea. It's just there's a bewildering array of, okay, so there's 4 different sizes of square markers. There's rectangular markers. There's round markers. There's little teardrop shaped markers. There's little odds markers. There's all kind. I mean, every different kind of marker has its own shape. I found it distracting when trying to learn that game, which I don't believe I actually accomplished, by the way. So, John, I don't know if you're aware, but one of the OCS games that is in development is the Luzon campaign. We actually, one of our local fellas has that on a playtest table at the moment. I believe he's done with it now. It's quite small, and I think they're trying to figure out, meaning the OCS team, is trying to figure out how to release it. It may end up being in a magazine, either Special Ops or in maybe a hypothetical Operational Matters 2. So one day, it's probably never happened, but one day I would like to go to the Philippines just for the food, about which I have heard many glorious tales. Now, Stigler mentions the so some people dislike I'm gonna say the Dean Essig map art style, and I don't. I only dislike it when the color palette becomes too insane and psychedelic, as it did in many of those Civil War Brigade series titles. In like OCS and in most SCS games that share that same map style, it doesn't bother me in any way. All right. There is an enormous quantity of transport units available here in OCS Burma. I will say that this stuff I think does not mature well in the glass. It is, however, very inexpensive for single malt Scotch, which is kind of why I bought it. Because I wanted to get back to Scotch. Because I like Scotch. I did not dislike it that intensely when I started drinking it, and now I'm disliking it very intensely and may get something different. We'll see. All right, so MMP did well to keep the GCACW maps from Avalon Hill. So, you know, in a lot of ways, I was thinking about this driving around the other day. In a lot of ways, I feel like the Great Campaigns of the American Civil War series was a better match for victory games than it would have been for Avalon Hill. Innovative systems, non-mounted maps. I think those are better. Those two are a better combination for victory games. And I'm not sure of the exact timetable. I think the last games that Victory Games really produced as an independent studio came out about 87. So that sounds about right. Somebody can correct me if that's wrong. I'll drink Jim Beam. I have no problem drinking Jim Beam. I don't want to buy Jim Beam because I believe it costs about $7 too much because of the price of the label. But it's not bad. Drink it on the rocks, no problem. I got no issue with that at all. I got no issue drinking Dewar's on the rocks, but I would drink it on the rocks. I wouldn't drink it neat. So the MMP got to inherit Charles Kibler with ASL, and he did the original Great Campaigns of the American Civil War maps as well. Somebody else did the maps for Grant Takes Command, I think. I think that was Rick Barber. Might have been somebody else, or I might have the game mixed up because it's a bit of a mix-up. But I believe those to be the best looking Wargame maps ever done. Just flatly. That's my opinion based on art, so take that for what it's worth. But that is my opinion, and I have said that many, many times, and I will continue to say that the Great Campaigns of the American Civil War maps are the most gorgeous maps in Wargaming. I literally, one reason why I got the Avalon Hill versions was so that I can someday frame them and put them on a wall in a hypothetical game room when that happens. Yeah, so the Square Gettysburg, I think the game was originally on the original version of Avalon Hill's Gettysburg was on squares. I also want to say that of the really old Avalon Hill games, I think that might be the only one that I think is really worth looking at nowadays, is that Gettysburg game. I don't think the Bulge game is, to be honest. People will disagree with that. That's fine. I don't think their Bulge game is. What was some of the other super early ones? Oh, Tactics 2. I got no interest. I've never had any interest in those. And even as a kid, seeing them in the catalog, I would scratch my head thinking, is this like something, like a historical thing? What's going on with this? Is this just like a fantasy map? I don't understand. There is... Brant is right. I could just add the Mountain Dew to it. That would fix it. I like Knob Creek as well. Purple Norseman, there is, in fact, at some stage of the development pipeline, and I don't believe it's close, there is a game that deals with a topic of the Second Sino-Japanese War, the land war in China. I very much would like to see that, but we'll see. I don't think it's Operation Ichigo, which is kind of what I would want to do in OCS, given the nature of OCS and given the nature of Operation Ichigo. But that might end up being too big, too. Craig, I am not having that problem with any of my GCACW maps, but I will say that they remember that Avalon Hill was their own printer, and they didn't care. So a lot of times they would have printing problems and they would never get fixed, printing or die cutting or similar problems, and they would never get fixed because Avalon Hill didn't care. So I don't doubt that that's true. 90 viewers, holy cow. I have no idea what is going on. I would like to thank everybody for stopping by. Wardrobe, I would definitely recommend. I've done a number of videos, and Patrick, I can't remember Patrick's last name. Well, if you search on YouTube search for On to Richmond, and you'll find his channel, and he does a lot of detailed playthroughs of Great Campaigns of the American Civil War stuff. In fact, he's one of the reasons why I don't have more of that on my channel, because he was like just junking them out, just like boom, ba boom, ba boom, ba boom, ba boom. Not to say that they're junk, they're not. They're very well done, and was just cranking them out. So I was not keeping them. I'm not able to do stuff at that kind of pace. Just not, certainly not this week. I'd love a copy of 1776, actually. Avalon Hill's Blitzkrieg, Avalon Hill's Stalingrad. There's people that really like that game. I think that game's a joke. In retrospect, I mean, at the time when it came out, it was something interesting because it was like the early 60s. Now, there's no reason to revisit Avalon Hill's Stalingrad. There's just not. GCACW is highly soloable as well. Patrick Pence, thank you guys for mentioning that. Yeah, he's really going through the scenarios at a rapid pace on that. The old Avalon Hill Chancellorsville. Now, see, I've heard fairly negative things about Chancellorsville. Now, I haven't played it. because who has? Because it came out like 1961 or something like that. So my knowledge of it is a bit limited to what I saw Gilbert Collins talk about. So bear that in mind. GCACW is the Great Campaigns of the American Civil War series. There is another very different series called the Great Battles of the American Civil War series. This does create confusion. Great Battles of the American Civil War series predates the Great Campaigns series, but I think the Great Battles was idle when Great Campaigns began, so I think they felt okay doing it, and then Great Battles got revised. Or revived. Great Campaigns is currently being published by Multi-Man Publishing. Great Battles is currently being published by GMT Games. They are both worthwhile. They are not comparable, other than they're both Civil War games. One's operational, one's tactical. One deals with the battle, one deals with the campaigns. They're both very good. Great Campaigns, specifically, though, is one of my favorite, if not my favorite, game series. It is a wonderful, evocative, subtle, and elegant game system that I cannot possibly recommend highly enough. So, which night? Oh, you're talking, Matt Taylor, you're talking about the Avalon Hill 1914. Yeah, those were the old pink and blue monstrosity counters. Somebody, was it Gilbert Collins? It might have been, did a video on 1914 not that long ago, and that was a game that I think is another one that doesn't probably hold up very well. Speaking of old classics, I think I will say this. There's let me put the topic of the night to bed. GCACW is not difficult, but it's weird. It's weird to a lot of gamers, and so a lot of wargamers who have not experienced that particular type of weird system to bounce off of it. It's not particularly difficult. We have seen a lot of games come out that have been inspired by the games that we are now seeing reprinted. Games like the Victory Games Civil War. Haven't really seen anybody... Well, that's not true. We have seen somebody try to do a new Pacific War 2. That was the Decision Games War in the Pacific. I could do an entire show on how terrible the Decision Games War in the Pacific is and why. It is an embarrassing debacle. It basically took the most interesting part of the SPI War in the Pacific and replaced it with the same mechanism from the Victory Games Pacific War that was the part of Victory Games Pacific War's campaign, like strategic campaign scenario that worked least well. So just ludicrously impractical. So I'm trying to think to see where Wardrobe is asking, are the rules backward compatible? If you are talking about great campaigns, so sort of, they're compatible back to Grant Takes Command. They're not compatible with games prior to that, unless you have the replacement counter sheet that came with Skirmisher number 1. Now I have that counter sheet, so I'm covered. And you might be able to get, if you reach out to Patrick, he may be able to hook you up with one of those counter sheets, actually. That's possible. But any game forward from Grant Takes Command, which is the game in which they introduced a standard series rulebook, you can absolutely play with those same core rules. I want to say, I could be mixing this game up. I think that Alexander the Great game was a Gary Gygax design, I think. GBACW. Yeah, I suppose you could play the current system. You'd have to come up with roster sheets or no, I guess you could use the hit counters to reflect strength points. That would be a bit of a pain in the ass, but you could do it. A local guy bought, when I say Buddy Unboxing, that's the guy, bought the DG War in the Pacific with expansion. It's insane. It's insane. It's a totally hopeless product that was clearly not play tested. I don't want to bag on the designer too much, because not that long after the game was released, the designer passed away. But obviously we're not getting ongoing designer support from that. I don't think the maps are very attractive. I will be happy to say that. The counters I do not feel are particularly attractive. They are reminiscent of the advanced ETO and advanced PTO counters that Decision Games did, which are also very unattractive, in my opinion, counters. The Eagle and the Sun. Local fellas trying to find that too, actually. That is the Fresno Games Association sort of attempt to redo War in the Pacific, except they didn't even try to or pretend that they play tested it. It's an unfinished game kit. There is value in nostalgia, as I think we have seen. So Stigler points out that the SPI Great Battles of the American Civil War was brought to us originally by the late great Richard Berg, and I think the first game in the series was Stigler can correct me on this, was actually Stonewall, but then it changed a bit, and the next version of the game was in Terrible Swift Sword. And then they started, they named the series Great Battles of the American Civil War, and they started coming out in either boxed games or in S&T as magazine games, or both. I have a few of those. I have Cedar Mountain, I have Pea Ridge, and I have one other one. I don't have Drive on Washington, I know that. So the series passed to SPI, passed to TSR. TSR did four games in the series. They redid Terrible Swift Sword. They did Rebel Sabers, which is more or less related, and you could theoretically tack it on to Terrible Swift Sword to do the cavalry actions off map at Gettysburg. They did A Gleam of Bayonets, which is Antietam, which I would like to play someday, actually, unless we get good news about a new Antietam game coming, which would be great. And they did another one in the magazine that was either TSR or 3W. And then Berg self-published or published through his publisher one or two other games, which include the original version of Dead of Winter, which is Stones River or Murfreesboro, if you like. I know the battle better as Murfreesboro in that particular case, but that is the Confederate name for it. And then it passed to GMT, where it relaunched under the name 3 Days of Gettysburg, which is the GMT version of Terrible Swift Sword, of which there have been 3 printings, of which the last one is the definitive one. Well, and I don't want to say definitive, because I've played it. I think it's got issues. But it's the most definitive of the 3 GMT versions. Now, between the old days and the new days under GMT, there was a systems change in which it became a chit pull system, and not an I go, you go system. I think that's substantially more interesting at that scale. So I prefer the new system, but particularly for the smaller battles, like Cedar Mountain or something like that, there's nothing wrong with the old system. That's just a preference issue. So, all right. The Skirmisher magazines. I actually have copies of the magazines, but not of the counter sheets. Physical copies, that is, not PDFs. I would love to see them put those up on Wargame Vault. I think that's just a matter of time, actually. I don't believe they're hedging. I think they're just slow. The vastly higher priority project was the ASL rulebook, which is now up. And now the vastly higher priority project is fixing all the problems with the ASL rulebook. I should talk about this at some point, actually. Maybe this is worth its own episode, but I'll talk about how to manage your wargame rules, right? At the table, my strong preference is to have physical copies of the rules. I think flipping through digital rules on a phone is a pain in the ass. I'd rather not. I'd rather have a physical copy. However, just like for reading the rules, I prefer to have it in an electronic format. So what I do is I have a cloud storage solution. Now, you can use whatever you want. You can use Boxer or Dropbox or Google Drive or whatever. I use Microsoft OneDrive because it's fully integrated into Windows. And I have a folder on there called Wargame Rules. And in there, I keep electronic copies of everything that I have in the world of Wargame Rules. That means that because it's in the cloud, I can install the OneDrive app on my tablet, and I can read the rules in bed, or I can install it on my phone and have it with me when I am at the game and say we need to find something and I need to search, which is something you can't do with a physical rule book. I can bust it out and get to the bottom of it. And it is super, super, super handy. So I have relatively low patience for publishers who are not putting electronic copies of their rules online. I think the only game that can afford, the only war game that can get away with charging people for that is probably ASL. Because you buy the rule book, right? You don't buy a set and you have the whole box. You buy a rule book, which is a weird way to do it, but the rule book is so big, and the set that you would buy with it, which contains the basic components, is so big that maybe Avalon Hill back in the day felt that they had to do it that way. I would like to see Multiman come up with a more modern publishing solution for that material. And I think it's coming. I think it's just slow. But I can't recommend, I mean, I want the physical rule book, like I said, for at the table, but I can't recommend having a digital copy also highly enough. And yes, there have been occasions where I have downloaded the rule book, looked through it, said, I don't like this, and not bought it. That's fine. But then I didn't play it either. So that's fine. That is, that's just good communication on the part of the publisher. Because if I had bought it, opened it up, spent $90 or whatever on it, and then I'd have been sore about paying whatever it was for this crappy game, right? Wardrobe asks if I've done an episode purely on ACW games. It is a popular topic. I mean, it's not as popular as World War II as a topic, but it's in the top handful of wargame topics. The trouble with that is, how do you limit that? I mean, there have been vastly more World War II games, but how do you? I mean, you'd have to narrow it down, right? You'd have to say World War II tactical or Civil War tactical games, or Civil War strategic games, or Civil War games about this particular Gettysburg games, for example, on this particular battle or this particular campaign. Operational Civil War games, however, is not, there have been quite a few actually, but it's a little less wide open than, say, battle games. Americans, anyway, tend to think of Civil War as a topic in the context of this battle or that battle, rather than this campaign or that campaign. And that's one of the great things about Great Campaigns, the American Civil War, is it shows you the importance of the operational level in that conflict, in seeing, hey, these are the operational concerns that prevented Lee from properly concentrating his army at Gettysburg, for example. Or McClellan from properly concentrating, other than McClellan's general incompetence, concentrating at Antietam. And it puts you in the shoes of those commanders, because that is the point. People sometimes criticize Great Campaigns because they say, it's hard for big battles to happen. That's the point. That is the challenge of Great Campaigns in the American Civil War, is to get everything to fire just right, for all your maneuvers to happen correctly, and luck to be on your side in the form of die rolls. so that you can get that big battle off. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But again, that is one of the big things that the system is trying to show you. Now, see, that's another thing though. Is I am not buying a rule book that I've already bought the rule book, right? Like I said, I think ASL is the only game that can realistically get away with that. People are complaining about that. Oh, I already bought the rulebook. I gotta buy another rulebook. I was like, well, wait a minute. If you were gonna buy another rulebook, you'd need to buy another rulebook, right? And I am a little bit sympathetic to that, but at the same time, it's going to be such an enormous, and I haven't bought it yet, but I will. It's going to be such an enormous tool to use, that digital ASL rulebook. For particularly, I mean, how many pages is that rulebook? 800 pages? It's crazy. When we're counting, chapter H, which is all the vehicle notes and ordnance notes and stuff like that too. But it's just a stupidly large rule book. Even if we leave that out, it's a large rule book. Most people don't put the chapter H stuff in the rules binder. They put it in another separate binder or separate. Kenneth, I disagree with that. He had to wait all that time. Lee's real problem, though, was intelligence at Gettysburg. He didn't know what he was facing, and that was his biggest problem. But he was not able to get Longstreet's corps into the battle until the second day. Stigler mentions that ACW is interesting in that the differences between operational and tactical is so stark. That's true. I mean, I would agree with that. I mean, I think if you have a tactical World War II game and an operational World War II game and a tactical Civil War game and an operational Civil War game, those two games at the two different levels are going to be far more different in Civil War than they are in operational. I think that's true. Stigler, that's the reason I don't buy print and play games, though. Because if we're talking, it's going to take me 50 hours to do that. And that's about, with my scan, it's about what it would take. I'll just buy the damn thing for $40. I'm happy with that. I also realized that, assembling your own counters is a lot of work. That Gordon, that's Panzer. That's absolutely true. Artillery is one of the really interesting facets of great campaigns of the American Civil War, where if you are attacking and you do not have enough of an artillery superiority, you take a penalty. That's absolutely true. John, Longshore, I've seen people make that case, and I think that's a reasonable conclusion that Lee was not good on the offensive. I think Lee was better on the offensive than I mean, let's not underrate the challenges of being, on the offensive in unfriendly territory, which was the case in both the Antietam and Gettysburg campaigns. The Shelby Foote trilogy is a wonderful piece of writing. I got my issues with his approach, philosophical issues with his approach, but it is very well written. I will make the case that when reading Shelby Foote, bear in mind that Shelby Foote was not a historian. He was a novelist. And that is, in fact, what you are getting. You are getting a very well-written narrative of the Civil War campaigns and battles. And on that level, that work is a very good work, and totally worth your time. Just bear in mind, he's only giving you that. He's not giving you larger context, and then you're fine. I tried making my own counters. So I made my own counters, the single-sided counters, and I'm like, oh, these are okay. I'm going to try double-sided. No, double-sided counters was a fiasco. They turned out very badly. I need some kind of method to line them up on the back side to end up without huge and awful registration issues. Kenneth, you are absolutely right. Longstreet. Well, look. People blame Longstreet for this, but look at the difficulty in getting Longstreet's core to take action. That is the kind of problem I am specifically talking about. It's not just, and what that is in Great Campaigns of the American Civil War is it's a failed grand battle roll or grand battle roll. Or a grand battle roll that wasn't quite good enough, in that you could the coordination between the two wings of the army was not good enough to pull off what Lee was trying to do. I mean, in terms of force concentration on the operational level, yeah, Longstreet's core is there at that point, but it's not leveraged on the battlefield in terms of force concentration at the right time, at the time when Lee wanted it, which was when there was additional pressure being placed on that Union position. I'll eventually do a video on this. I use Inkscape for all that. It's a vector graphics program. I think the Adobe equivalent is Adobe Illustrator. The difference between the two is, I'm sure Illustrator is the business class standard for that kind of thing. Other than that, the difference is that it costs $1 million and Inkscape is free. So I will continue using Inkscape, cackling madly the entire time. I should specify that Inkscape is open source. So massive amount of transportation, supply transportation. I really want to play this, actually. Because, let's face it, I mean, this is one of those things. It's either you love or hate about OCS, is the supply management. Do you think it's, you're playing an accountant's fool's game by having to manage all these supply tokens on the map, or is that a high point of the game for you? I guess I'm a born accountant in that sense, because I like that. I like doing the paperwork and stuff like Pax Britannica or Flat Top and stuff like that. Or for that matter, in an old game like Stellar Conquest, that a lot of people hated it because of the bookkeeping. I don't mind that at all. I mean, I understand why people don't like that. It does kind of feel like you're scorekeeping for your bowling league, but it doesn't bother me in that sense. Where is the... I guess we'll put the improved roads in with the airstrips. How's that sound? And that, ladies and gentlemen, is Burma 2 in one counter tray. I think Panzer mentions earlier in the chat that there's some modifications to the supply system in Hungarian, the OCS supply system in Hungarian Rhapsody, and it does change the game fairly significantly. I will absolutely agree with that. Particularly for the Soviets. The Soviets have... It's not quite true to say it's a complete supply system replacement, but it feels like it is a lot of the time. You're not tracing to detrainable hexes. You're tracing to these Soviet front markers, which are not headquarters. They are front markers. They don't function as headquarters. But those headquarters is where supplies are concentrated and where replacements and reinforcements are concentrated. Wow, John Longshore's sister-in-law's great-grandfather was Devil Dan Sickles. The replacement system for the Soviets is very different in Hungarian Rhapsody as well. So if you're looking for a one-volume Civil War history that gives you the broader context, but also gives you a lot of detail about campaigns and battles, the James McPherson Battle Cry of Freedom is very good. According to Sickles, he was the savior at Gettysburg. And, a lot of Confederate juice was wasted on fighting Dan Sickles. Would the battle have turned out the same way had that not occurred? I'm not sure that it would have. I'm not sure Sickles is wrong about that. I'm also not sure he shouldn't have been hung for insubordination. But it's not a ludicrous case. And he got his leg blown off. That's true, too. And I think he, carried the leg around in a preserved format for the rest of his life, too. Something like that. I might be misremembering that exact factoid. So, let's see if we can catch up to the chat. I really like the Civil War Brigade series idea of orders. I like the line of battle implementation a little bit better, I think. Now, that's a different scale, right? It's not brigade anymore. It's a regiment at that point. But yes, JPJ 5010, the whole damn battlefield at Gettysburg is Dan Sickles' monument. That's what he said. And again, I'm not sure that a lot of Confederate manpower and focus was wasted fighting, not wasted necessarily, was spent dislodging Sickles from that position. Blitzkrieg Legend looks interesting. I haven't played that one. I don't know where my copy is. I have the sale copy, and I'm scratching my head. It's I don't know where mine is. Did I accidentally ship it to somebody? I hope not. That's possible. There is a book called Sickles at Gettysburg, which I've read, which is pretty good. And he was a very colorful character. Literally got away with murder. First defense, I believe that set the precedent for not guilty of murder by reason of temporary insanity. I believe that was the actual case that created that precedent. So, yeah, definitely an interesting individual. I don't know that I'd want to be related to him, but definitely an interesting individual. Panzer says, Union General Jefferson C. Davis murdered his commanding officer and kept a command throughout the whole war. I'd have to read on I've forgotten the details about that. He's a somewhat less colorful character than Dan Sickles. Other than that is. I mean, one of the things that makes the Civil War attractive as a topic is the colorful characters that are available in the Civil War. So let's just take a look at counter sheets and make sure I don't need to clip anything else out of this. No, here's what's left out of the two counter sheets. Just markers, just OCS system markers, which I don't need. I'm not sure that that's even a unique situation, actually. I mean, I think that there are some of those names are... I think there's multiple cases of individual similar names on both sides. Van Dorn was an interesting, again, another colorful character. As was, Leonidas Polk, very colorful character. kind of the boring guy of, I mean, you get a lot of mileage out of Sherman as well. Kind of the boring guy was Joe Johnston, and one of the more competent Confederate generals at the Army level, actually, I think. John Bell Hood, another colorful character. So this is true of Napoleonics as well. Epic History TV, which is a YouTube channel, has a series out about Napoleon's greatest marshals, where they actually rank all of Napoleon's marshals in order, and I think they're up to episode 5, and there's one more. And they actually go through a lot of cool information that I didn't know about some of these folks. Some of them are reasonably colorful too. One of the interesting things that sticks, and I knew this, but it sticks out in the Napoleonic period, is that relatively few of those Napoleonic marshals ever held significant independent commands where Napoleon wasn't personally supervising them. And a lot of times when they did, as was a lot of times the case in the Peninsula Campaign, for example, they did not perform well. Napoleon was always worried about his commanders becoming too uppity and seizing power, as he had. So... Brian Jarvis, if we're talking about OCS, I have one tray of OCS series markers, but it's one of those big flat Doris bead trays with, I think, 24 compartments. And everything is meticulously sorted, because that's just me. As, for example, Stigler mentions, part of why tactical games are so great, you can relive the exploits of many famous generals and units. That's true, like when Stonewall Jackson got shot by his own men, you could relive that. That's great. He also points out, well, so the Confederate Army was not immune to political hacks either. And I point out one obvious example, who is Braxton Bragg. He was Jefferson Davis's buddy and kept his command only for that reason, despite displaying total incompetence on any number of occasions. And despite, like, literally his subordinate commanders all got together and wrote letters to Jefferson Davis saying, this guy's a clown, please get rid of him. And he was... there's more and better known examples on the Union side, the best known of whom was McClellan, obviously. I mean, this is the guy who had the stones to run for president against Lincoln in 1864, after all. So, Ziegel and Schimmelpfennig, and there was another one on the battlefield at Gettysburg, too, another well-known German leader. Although I think Schimmelpfennig was a colonel at the time, I think. I could be wrong about that. Siegel was general, though. I have never been to the Smithsonian, and I would really, really, really like to do that at some point. Let's just check in on stream analytics. That's another... Craig Forrest mentions political generals versus aristocratic generals. So that's another thing that comes out when you look at... I recommend looking at a game like Rise of the Roman Republic for this. Is a great example. And the Carthage game as well. Schertz was who I'm thinking of. A lot of those Roman commanders were clowns. Clowns. I mean, we don't remember the clowns. We remember Caesar and Pompey and Scipio and guys like that. A lot of those Roman guys were clowns. Those the two consuls that went to face Hannibal at Cannae, for example, buffoons, completely shit the bed. And that happened a lot. until, inevitably, the Romans just never gave up. So inevitably, they would keep going until they found somebody competent to run things. And then they would win gradually. And in the case of the Second Punic War, that turned out to be Scipio. There's a book by Liddell Hart called Scipio Africanus Greater Than Napoleon. I don't know if I necessarily agree with his title, but he's using, as Hart was prone to do, is using only those sources that support his thesis. In his case, he was relying on Livy as his really only source that he used, which was like hundreds of years later. Herodotus was like contemporary with Scipio and Hannibal, and is a far better source for that, and is considered now to be the more reliable source for the Second Punic War. That's true. So after a while, however, they started the offices of proconsul started to become much more common, and they started proruging the consuls so they would keep their military commands. If they were competent or well connected, if it was important. So Scipio won his big triumph, I think, as a proconsul at Zama. I do not recall Sickles being... So, I mean, Gettysburg is based on the... oh, damn it. What's the Michael Shara book called? That Gettysburg is based on. Somebody will say it in the chat. It's based on a book by Michael Shara, and it's... I mean, I feel like the movie and the book to a somewhat lesser extent have a weird pro-Confederate bias, because look at all the high-profile actors that got to play the Confederate generals, and then look at how they got to be Reynolds, who's some nameless soap opera guy, and who has 3 lines. They got somebody to play General Meade, who was a name, Richard Anderson, I think, who was David Hasselhoff's boss on Knight Rider, was his big claim to fame. And he's got like 1 or 2 lines in the movie. And it's a weirdly imbalanced movie in that respect. The only Union side folks that get the same amount of attention as Chamberlain and his guys. Killer Angels, that's the book I'm talking about. But, think about who produced the movie, where he's from, Ted Turner. We got that. They did get... And Buford is one of the characters that the movie does really well, I think. But then he doesn't, appear or isn't important in much of the film, either. He's, featured on the first day. But he's not featured more than any of the Confederate individuals. I really love the scene, by the way. And I really like the actor they got to play Harry Heath. Who rides up to Lee to give his report and is obviously completely befuddled. He might not. You're right. Richard Anderson. He was the boss in the $6 Million Man, not the boss in Knight Rider. I don't think. You're absolutely right about that, John. It is. I like Gettysburg. It's a great movie. It's got a good soundtrack. It's, as somebody who has done reenacting, not Civil War reenacting, it's also amuses me to see the sort of, let's call them pasty doughboys in some of those uniforms that are not in the kind of shape that the lean, the hard living soldiery would have been on the field at that time. It was a Ted Turner vanity project, and it managed to turn out okay, unlike Gods and Generals, which is universally considered to be a turd. I think Martin Sheen is not the greatest casting, but I think Martin Sheen is a great actor, and I think he pulled it off just fine. I think Robert Duvall, who played Lee in Gods and Generals, is a better choice for Lee. He looks more like Lee. I think he's related to Lee. Otherwise, the movie's totally... and I thought, oh, geez, I can't remember this guy's name either. The actor that plays Pickett he's also the bad guy in Avatar. The actor that plays Pickett in Gettysburg is the actor who plays Stonewall Jackson in Gods and Generals, and he's a great choice for Stonewall Jackson. The movie's just bad, and there's videos about that. You can watch that if you want. I mean, I like Martin. I've always liked Martin Sheen in virtually everything. The guy that played Hancock was okay. Wasn't great, I didn't think. He was okay. He had a couple of things going on, but I mean, they got like Richard Jordan to play Armistead, for example, who was like dying of brain cancer at the time. Stephen Lang is the actor's name, yes. Yeah, Harry Heath did not get a lot of screen time, but it was a good scene, and Lee is clearly there's a lot of subtext written into that scene. Actually, when Lee is telling me, I have not heard from General Stewart. Do you understand me, General? He's telling Heath, and Heath's not picking up on this. He's telling Heath that he has no idea what he is facing. I may be facing the entire Federal Army. He's telling Heath this, and He's a dimwit, is not getting it, and the actor pulls that off perfectly. It works. That scene works great. Gods and Generals is not worth your time. Gettysburg, I think, is. Gods and Generals is not worth your time. I wouldn't say it's one of my favorite war movies. My favorite war movie is A Bridge Too Far. I think I've said that before as well. Jeff Daniels was a very good choice for Chamberlain. Another thing is the hilariously inept facial hair, the fake facial hair in Gettysburg. I mean, it's really bad. The fake facial hair in Gods and Generals is somewhat better, but it's not great. I have never seen the film Paths of Glory. It's an early Stanley Kubrick movie. It's with Kirk Douglas. It's supposed to be really good. I have never seen it. I think scheduling... Tom Berenger has said that his favorite role ever was Longstreet. And I liked him as Longstreet. I think he was very good as Longstreet. I have seen the director's cut, in fact. It's the one I bought was the director's cut on Amazon. I think I bought it digitally. I've never seen 12 O'Clock High. He had exceptionally terrible pasted on beard, but then again, you know, a lot of those Civil War generals and everybody else, but Civil War generals are known for, because they took pictures of them, were known for their weird facial hair. So. I think that's the only major Stanley, other than like the super duper early ones, that's the only Stanley Kubrick movie I have not seen, actually. Brian Jarvis, I thoroughly disagree. I like Stanley Kubrick a lot. Certainly he had signature things that he would do as a director, but that was true of Hitchcock or John Ford or Martin Scorsese are all guilty of those exact things. I mean, you don't have to just compare 2001 to Barry Lyndon, for example, which is a fantastic movie, by the way. It's like the hidden Stanley Kubrick masterpiece that nobody has seen. Barry Lyndon, fantastic movie. Based on the Thackeray novel, which I haven't read, and which is a giant doorstop, and I'm never going to read it, I'm sure. But it is a wonderful and beautifully shot film. The sideburns are in fact named after Ambrose Burnside. So Burnside was sent to be a military advisor. Was one of a couple of Civil War individuals who was sent to advise the Germans during the Franco-Prussian War. The Duelist is an interesting movie, actually. I don't know if I'd call it a war movie, but it's a cool movie. I would have liked to have seen that too. I think the best Napoleon we got is the Bondarchuk Waterloo, I think. And it's a flawed movie in many ways, but Rod Steiger was fantastic in it. It's just that nobody else in the movie holds up. No actor in the movie holds up very well, or nearly as well as Steiger. Christopher Plummer, of course, is fine as Wellington, but he doesn't really have a lot to chew on. I mean, the movie's about Napoleon, let's face it, but there's some colorful, the guy that they got to play Ney was uninspired. They could have done something more interesting with that. The battle scenes, on the other hand, which involve tens of thousands of extras, are simply never been equaled. I mean, you look at that cavalry charge by the British cavalry, and it's just amazingly well. You're just like, holy cow! Just look at this cavalry charge. It's amazing. No, I have never seen Bridge Over the River Kwai, which I'm aware is a thing I should remedy. I was not a huge fan of Eyes Wide Shut. There's some interesting things in it from a Kubrick fan directorial standpoint. There's some interesting things in it, but I didn't find the movie very engaging. I'm not a Tom Cruise fan, which is probably a factor as well. I mean, there's a really potentially awesome scene with Ney where he is sent to apprehend Napoleon, and he has sworn to Louis the 18th, I think, that he is going to bring Napoleon back in an iron cage. And he goes out with the army, and there's Steiger's opportunity to shine. So you would like to kill your emperor? Here I am. Ney has to submit to him, right? And that's if that even happens in the movie, I don't remember it. It was that forgettable because the actor that they got was not very, very, very memorable. Of all Napoleon's marshals, because the thing's about Waterloo, right? Ney is the one that's most important to get right because he's the one that does the most. And the guy that played Blucher, who I mean, he was in the movie. He's like a background. He's like a piece of furniture. He looks great, but I mean, he just has nothing to do. I've heard good things about Generation War, but I haven't seen it. But Steiger is great. I mean, of the Napoleons that we have seen on film, I don't think it's close. I mean, remember that Steiger's playing Napoleon in 1815, right? He's not playing Napoleon of 1805. So bearing that in mind, Steiger might not be the right guy to play Napoleon in 1805, but he absolutely was the right guy to play Napoleon in 1815 in that movie. It's a great movie. Zulu is another one that's on my watch list. I haven't seen the whole movie. I've seen parts of it. Yeah, something like that. They got like some many thousands of Red Army soldiers to actually be the extras in the movie. So we got about 20 more minutes, by the way. We have blown the doors off the counterclipping stream record this evening. So I hope that we did justice to the topic of the night. If anybody has any last minute questions or if we want to circle back to that, pipe up in the chat now. That's a great scene. That is a great scene. Yeah, he totally is. He was in Gandhi too, actually. John Raffensperger. I'm having trouble putting that name together somehow. But he was in Gandhi as well. He had a little bit part in Gandhi. Actually, I think he was a driver in Gandhi too, wasn't he? I could be wrong about that. I think 92 is where we topped out. That's like 20 more than we've ever had before. Cross of Iron is a fabulous movie. That's a great Sam Peckinpah film. circling back to actually the Time Bandits Napoleon. I mean, played for comedic effect by Ian Holm, the late Ian Holm. He was actually really good as Napoleon. So, should publishers be reprinting? Are we consuming too much bandwidth, I guess, is the problem with all these reprints of classic games. So, let's look at GMT, because I've lost track of how many Compass is doing. GMT is redoing Russian Campaign. It's an old Avalon Hill, and prior to that was Jedco title. So, they have that in the pipeline. That's been in the pipeline forever. I'd have to actually look at the number. It might have been 95. 92 was the highest I saw, but I'd have to look at the analytics, which I normally don't do until after the stream. They have the Mark Herman Pacific War. They have the Victory Games Vietnam. I've never played Russian Campaign, which is another one of those things. It's like, I really should do that. I want to say that's it from GMT. And is it different from, like, them working on a new edition of one of their own games? Is it somehow a different class of project to say that we're doing a new edition of Victory Games Civil War, or Victory Games Vietnam War, versus our new edition of our own game, Barbarossa Army Group Center? Are those different in some way? I mean, they're different in a trivial sense, in that the last edition was from somebody else, but are those different logistically from a project management standpoint? I'm not sure that they are, but again, I don't know enough about GMT's internal operations to say, right? Compass, the situation might well be different from Compass, because so much of the stuff that they are working on is reprints in various stages of reprintedness, right? So just offhand, this is not going to be comprehensive, because the ones I'm interested in, the Frank Chadwick Third World War series, the Joe Belkowski Korean War series. There's also the Joe Belkowski Fleet series, which is somewhere in the pipeline. There's the Eric Lee Smith Victory Games Civil War. There's the new Bruce Maxwell NATO: The Next War in Europe. There's the Compass version of Russian Campaign, which is like the designer's original intent edition, based on the Jedco version. There's Carrier Battles Philippine Sea. Is that the same kind of project? It's based on the old carrier system, but it's a new scenario set for that system. Is that in the same category for that reason? Maybe it isn't. I don't know. Is on our ongoing series taking away from publisher impetus, in the sense of, say, the new Battle Hymn game from Eric Lee Smith, actually, which will be Shiloh and Bentonville, I believe. There's people that like that series, right? Is that eating up too much publisher logistical capacity and enthusiasm? So at some point we have to circle back to the question of what the designers want to do, right? If designer wants to make and we talked about this in the, do we need another Bulge game? If the designer wants to do a Bulge game, or another game in the Battle Hymn series, or a new version of Flat Top, I'm not going to try and second guess that designer. Now, somebody might say, I would prefer to see a new voice, or at least an old voice, saying something new. And that's a completely reasonable thing to say, that I am not interested in this for this reason. But, designers are going to design what they want to design, and publishers are going to publish what they want to publish. Compass, I think, is just, they're taking the games that they're submitted. GMT, I think, is suffering from bottlenecks, as we've discussed, for reasons I don't feel qualified to comment on. Somebody asked about Napoleon's Triumph, which is the Austerlitz game, if I'm not mistaken, based on... Is that a Bowen Simmons title? That sounds right. I've seen it set up. It's gorgeous. I don't know anything about it other than that. It's got a very neat sort of miniatures-esque type of system with little rectangular wooden units. That's neat, but I mean, other than that, I can't comment on it. Mark Humphreys says that too many remakes are disimprovements, which is definitely true. I don't know that I'd say too many. Well, yeah, no, I would say too many. Any is too many. But I don't think that's a majority of cases. But it is definitely has happened, and I don't think you can argue with that. Like the best example I can think of is the one that we brought up before, which was the Decision Games War in the Pacific, which is an embarrassing debacle. I believe I described it as. It is not worth your time, and definitely not worth your $600 that it would cost to go get it. Brian Jarvis says the pale yellow map paper compass uses is a turnoff for me. That is not something that I know what you're talking about. Do you have a specific game in mind that used a disagreeable map paper? Now, what I will say is that, so I have Saipan, which is the first CSS game, and it's on that older, sort of really shiny map stock that along the creases, the ink tends to chip like really easily and really badly. Rachel Simmons, that's correct. That stock I don't like, but they don't use that anymore. They haven't used that for a couple of years. So Craig Forrest asked a good question. How many of these old games are still available on the secondary market for cheaper than a reprint could sell for? Quite a few of them, actually. So I don't think Compass has put up for pre-order the Eric Lee Smith Civil War yet, but I anticipate that that's going to be something like somewhere between $80 and $120. That's totally spitballing, but you can get an unpunched copy of that for $50 handily. The counters are exceptionally bad by modern standards. The map is actually, I think, holds up a little bit better. I don't have any huge problems with the map. It's not attractive in a modern sense, but it holds up reasonably well. The counters are ghastly, however, and really need to be redone. In fact, I started redoing them, but then they announced this, so I stopped. So. Maps in the African campaign. A pale yellow paper for that topic might not be a bad choice. I have looked at the inside of African campaign, but not lately, so I can't speak to the map stock that they used in that game. I can tell you that they are using different paper map stock now than they were a couple of years ago. I think I've seen some both positive and negative commentary on Air Force and Dauntless. I have the Avalon Hill version, and at some point I would like to play them. I did not see that issue with Fortress Europa either. Let me put it that way. But I didn't handle the maps in Fortress Europa. I've literally seen it on a table at a con. So it came out after African campaign. I don't know, but like I said, they're not using that paper stock anymore. But I haven't necessarily handle any Compass paper map stock that's been released in the last year or so. So I don't know. I will agree with you that they have had some issues with that problem. I'm not sure which specific paper stock you're talking about, but the Far West expansion. That's part of the core, John. That's part of the core game for Victory Games Civil War. That's not really. I mean, it's kind of tacked on, but I expect it to. Yeah, I think it's going to be in there. That is not like a separate thing. That is part of. It's optional. It's part of the core game. So, Hamadad, so the Decision Vakdam Rhine is a complete redesign, and I like Goss. this is kind of a separate question, because what we're talking about now is a thing where it's a total ground up redesign. It does not at all resemble the classic Vakdam Rhine. The next Gauss game, by the way, has been informally announced. It is Market Garden, and we'll cover like the flanks of Market Garden as well, which most Market Garden games do not bother to do. So the question with the Gauss games, Vakdam Rhine and Atlantic Wall, then becomes, should they have used those titles, right? They're good titles, and I think that's why they used them. Nevertheless, there's a possibility that somebody bought those games, one or both of those games, without realizing what they were getting into. Because it's a total redesign, and in both cases you had the older terrible Gauss rulebook. The current version is much better. Stigler, I don't know about Chihuahua, but dog definitely. I've also found myself sitting next to a farting cat, so that has happened in here, and farting dog too, but. We have one of ours is informally nicknamed Senor Stinkbutt, because he has cleared the room in the past with his flatulence. I do feel a little bit like we do dedicate a part of the show every week to complaining about decision games. Which is not my intention, but let's face it, there's a lot of people who are unhappy with some of their practices and some of their releases. That's just the way it is. I do not feel that, and I've stood up for them to some extent, because there's some of their games I like. I like Gauss. I like the D-Day series, for example, and I think they've done a few other things that are noteworthy as well. In some cases, underappreciated, like Storm of Steel, for example, which I think is probably underappreciated. But they screw a lot of stuff up too. Let's face it. Both from a marketing standpoint, in like say reusing SPI titles for completely different. I've filled this up once. I usually fill this up once, maybe twice, but just once. I'm not crazy about this. It was cheap. I'm glad that it was cheap. It's not very good. I mean, it's not terrible. I'll end up using it. Maybe I'll give it to unwanted guests when they arrive. That's possible. Here, have a single malt scotch. You'll love it. It's great. Actually, when that happens, if they're not Scotch people, I like to give them Lafroig, and see the faces that they make. You know, I only have one decision game with side nibs, and it's Empires of the Middle Ages, and I'm like, I don't know what's up with that. Why is that's a thing for that particular game? I don't have any other games. I'm not saying they didn't do any, but I don't have any other decision titles with center nibs on the counters. Just, lots of folks have expressed dissatisfaction with Desert Fox Deluxe for a variety of reasons. There's also the weird decision games thing where we had a perfectly good, or at least, here's this game, and this particular thing in this game was not messed up. We're going to republish it, but we're going to introduce this new mistake in our new edition of it. That's such a weird thing. And it's not particularly, it's not, well, I mean, we did a stream at some point, and maybe we'll circle back to this talk at some point about our war games too expensive, and the fact is that people will complain if they raise the prices. People complain that decision games are too expensive right now. People complain about Multi-Man and Compass because of the thing that we mentioned earlier, where that Compass Victory Games Vietnam 3 maps 6 counter sheets. Again, that's a $200 game from any publisher other than GMT. GMT's probably going to be able to print more copies of it. Makes a huge difference. I don't know exactly where the discount breaks are right now, but it is a vast difference between printing 500 copies of something and printing 5,000 or 15,000 copies of something. I don't know what their print runs are, right? Except on the few that they've announced, where like Twilight Struggle, where they can print 25,000 copies. But that's safe, that's a safe bet. They can print 25,000 copies of Twilight Struggle. They're going to sell it. It was the #1 game on BGG's ranking for years. There was a South Park episode about it, for Pete's sake. So, Barbarossa Deluxe, I don't know anything about that. I like their new version of Battle for Germany. I like their new version of RAF. I like their new version of the D-Day games. So I've played Pelelu and Omaha, and I like them. I'm not sure what printing we are at Omaha. If we're at third printing still, then there's errata counters, which is a source of great rage, because it was like errata that was there in the first edition. They fixed it in the second printing, and then they brought the problems back in the third printing, and that is clownish incompetence, is what that is. I would like game companies, publishers, and designers to make money. I would like to live in a world where a really gifted game designer can make a living designing games. And if we absolutely demand games be sold at the lowest possible price, then I think that is incompatible with my idealized notion of the world we ought to live in. I always find that C3I is worthwhile, aside from the errata stuff. So the latest issue I bought, not because of the errata counters, but although there were, but because of the game material that was in there. That's why I bought it. Not the game. Let me clarify. For the articles and the scenarios for GBOH and stuff like that. Not the game, the Kursk game, which looks good for what it is, but it's not in my wheelhouse. So I don't feel like that's something I could do, is actually add a little water to this, and sometimes that will help more than you'd think. You're not just watering it down, you're potentially opening up the nose, and you can change what it tastes like by doing that sometimes. And I didn't do it here because it's 40%. I normally don't find that I need to do that if it's bottled at 40%. Normally. There are exceptions. The Shadow knows. I am a big fan of the Shadow, actually. I have read some of the original books by Maxwell Grant was the trade name that they used at the time. The radio drama was pretty cool. The character actually originated as a radio drama character and then evolved in its own pulp magazine. So I'm familiar with the Shadow. It's where Orson Welles got an early start, actually, was as the voice of the Shadow. So, all right, we are at 10 p.m., so we have gone just a hair, because I started a couple minutes early, just a hair over 2 hours. So I would like to thank everybody. I will not have a Traveler Tuesday. Let's talk briefly about what's coming up this week. I will not have a Traveler Tuesday video. Like I said, we are working on that campaign. I hope to be able to make the announcement video next Tuesday. On Thursday, we have an unboxing. This week it is The Battle for Armageddon, or The Battle of Armageddon, a new release from Compass Games, which Compass was kind enough to send to me. It is a very high production value thing. Cards, counters, mounted map. It's pretty nice. It is the biblical Battle of Armageddon in the end times. So if you are not interested in that topic, it is not going to be the game for you. But if you are interested in that topic, it may be the only game for you. So bear that in mind. But if you're interested in seeing the components, check out the unboxing video on Thursday. I have stacks and stacks of unboxing videos coming up. I don't know what is going to be scheduled the week after yet or not. If anybody wants to email me, they can reach me at Ardwulf's Lair, all one word, at gmail.com. Bear that in mind. And it's the same as the channel is spelled. Ardwulf's Lair, ARDWULF. So I'd like to thank everybody for stopping by again. We had another record-setting evening, and I almost feel bad about turning the stream off with 70 people here. But we have to go, and dogs got to get dealt with and all that. So I'd like to thank you all for stopping by. We will be back next Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern with the counterclipping stream. So thanks for watching, and I'll see everybody next time.